Welcome into All In with Adam, episode 6. I'm excited for this one because it appears we're going to go down some philosophical wormholes today, which is always exciting. For me, that is one of my favorite ways to spend my time is discussing large ideas, trying to dig to the bottom of really, really difficult questions. And the reason we're going to go down that path today, one is because I got a ton of philosophical questions, which is absolutely awesome. So some of these were sent to me via the email address for this podcast, which is allinwithadam@gmail.com. Other people called or texted the hotline. That number is on the screen now. So I got a handful of those questions that we're going to get into at the end of this podcast. And I think that those questions will sync up well with some of the messages that I have for you today, because really the bulk of this podcast will be about what I'm calling recovery, I guess. And it's weird for me to view myself as somebody in recovery. Truthfully, I don't view myself as somebody in recovery from addiction actively. I look at myself as someone who had a very specific problem that the world of psychology seems to know quite a bit about. Once I identified that problem, I made changes in my life to find a more stable position, right? To build a better foundation on which I can operate. That's what happened. And for a lot of people, this can happen without all of these labels of like former addict, recovering alcoholic, in recovery, falling off the wagon or on the wagon, right? Living a sober lifestyle or not. Like some of those black and white definitions, they just don't work for a lot of people. They don't really work for me. So while I am going to talk about recovery, what that looks like for me, or what it has looked like for me over the last 10 years, I want to be very clear that many of these messages could apply to anybody with a problem. If you have anything in your life that you suck at doing, and you finally hit some version of a rock bottom where you said, hey, I don't want to do things this way anymore, let me make a dramatic change and do something differently. If that's you, in any capacity, I have some thoughts and ideas in this podcast that I think will be helpful. So another good name for this podcast may have been something along the lines of stability or building a proper foundation. Something along those lines, right? So I have this podcast organized into 3 real parts before we get into some of these philosophical questions at the end, which are going to be quite fun. The first section here is things that I learned in rehab. I learned a lot of stuff in rehab, stuff that is somewhat specific to addiction, but many of them have sort of a larger narrative, these overarching points that could really apply to a lot of different things. But there's 6 main takeaways that I gathered from rehab that I want to share with you. After that, I want to talk about rejoining the world, because rehab in of itself is very much a bubble. It's an environment where you're very protected. It is by all definitions a safe space. And the world as a whole is not really like that. So if you're someone who's ever gone to rehab or knows someone who has gone to rehab, there is a jolt when you rejoin the world, because you realize the world doesn't give a shit about what you just had going on for the past couple months. So I want to talk about rejoining the world, some of the things that I dealt with when I first had that car crash back into reality, into the real world. A lot of weird things happen, and I could have been better prepared. So I want to share with you some of those things. And then finally, I want to close out with long-term stability, which is some of the things that I had to do to get a really solid footing under me, not just in the context of alcoholism and staying sober or not drinking, but, it's not that simple. It's not just about you not drinking. There's a thing that happens that I'm going to cover in this podcast called being a dry drunk. A dry drunk is when you are not drinking, but in one way or another, your life still revolves around alcohol. A lot of people can relate to this who have had substance problems. Stopping might be possible. That might be something that you can do. You can just will that into existence and don't put this drug in your body. Done. But that doesn't solve everything. It doesn't scratch that itch that you have. It doesn't make your thoughts redirect towards something healthy. It doesn't make you happy. It doesn't lift the burden of sobriety. So there's a whole lot of things that I've had to do to find a stability, to to make sure that I am happy, that I'm functional, that I'm productive without alcohol. That required a lot of work. And I think this applies to anybody, again, who's just had something that you suck at that you wanted to change. Because for me, that's about as far as I care to take the definition of being an alcoholic personally. I had a problem. I had to do some things to fix it. So in that sense, I hope this podcast can be applicable to a wider range of people. And we will definitely step well outside of the bounds of addiction psychology, recovery, and all of those smaller little boxes or categories today. So things that I learned at rehab. The first of 6 here is that there is something that happens around 6 weeks into sobriety that is very different than what you might experience in the prior 5 weeks. And 6 weeks seems to be this magic number for a lot of people. It could certainly vary. But when you're in the depths of addiction, for me, there was a heavy fog that oftentimes translated into depersonalization and derealization, which is a specific type of anxiety I talked about a little bit in the last episode. But that fog, it doesn't just go away. It starts to a little bit, but maybe only 10 or 15%. It's really this blanket over your consciousness, over your self-awareness, and it's really hard to shake. And even if you took somebody who wasn't, let's say, an alcoholic, but someone who was drinking 3-4 nights a week, they could probably relate to that fog, right? Just a weekend of drinking. Or you smoked weed a few days in a row. You know what that foggy feeling is sort of like. And sometimes you might say, well, you know what? This next week I'm going to not drink. I'm going to not smoke pot. I'm going to take a little bit of time off. And you may feel that fog lift a little bit, but something about 6 weeks of sobriety, there seems to be this magic number there. And something happened to me in rehab that I remember this day. There was a specific day where my counselor, whose name was Stacy, and the yoga teacher, whose name was Christine, on the same day, both of them came to me and said something along the lines of, "There you are," or like, "Welcome back." And both of them said this within a couple hours of each other, and I asked what they meant, and both had kind of the same explanation. They said, "You're finally here. There's something in your eyes, in your vibe, in your voice, where that fog is kind of gone, isn't it?" And I said, "Shit, I think it is. I think it is. There's like a level of clarity. There's a baseline clarity that is assigned to sobriety that takes a while to find. And it might take a lot longer if you're someone who's been, I don't know, drunk or high for 20 or 30 years. It might take a little bit longer than 6 weeks. But for me, that's right around when it happened. And it was discernible to other people around me that I had in some way like come back or woken up in a weird way. So for anybody that is experimenting with sobriety, maybe you're just a weekend drinker. You don't have to be an alcoholic. But if you're going to spend some time being completely sober, set that number at 6 weeks and see what happens. Because in my experience, it makes a big difference to have that amount of time. Even 30 days doesn't quite do it for some people. So 6 weeks, something special about that number. The second thing that I learned in rehab is that everybody has a different rock bottom. And I touched on this briefly in the last episode, but I want to expand on it a little bit here. And really, this steps so far outside the bounds of addiction because, again, this type of message could apply to anybody who has a thing that you're doing that sucks, that doesn't serve you, that is detrimental to you, to your well-being, to your happiness. You're doing this thing, this behavior, and you want to change it. Or maybe you just have the thought that maybe you want to change it. You're only going to make that change when you hit what is your own personal rock bottom. And that is this psychological level where when you assess that behavior and its consequences, you say, I don't like this, and I don't like it to the point where I will do something different now. I am making a change. This could be somebody who's struggling with their weight, and they look in the mirror, and one day, boom, they hit that rock bottom. They hit this point where their psychology no longer allows them, for one reason or another, to continue down this road, and they decide to turn around. Now, what's fascinating is that everybody has a different point along that path where they decide to turn around. For some people, the path never ends. You would call that a person you would describe that as a person whose rock bottom is death. Those people exist. There are people who can lose their jobs, their cars, their wives, their families or their husbands, their mom, their dad. They steal from their family. They lose all of their friends. They have nowhere to live. They're homeless. Everyone who's ever loved them now hates them. They go all the way there. And somehow it's not enough to do something different. Somehow they're still putting a needle in their arm, or they're still drinking, or whatever their DOC is. And it's fascinating because you would think if that was me, well, I would have clearly drawn the line here. I would have said, no. Not when I can't see my kids anymore. Too far. Something has to be different here. And the reality is that it just doesn't line up the same for everybody. So it makes it very difficult to be empathetic, because you can't imagine what it's like to be so handcuffed to a drug or a substance or any unhealthy behavior so tightly that even as your life crumbles beneath you, you don't decide to do anything different. You wouldn't grab a life jacket if someone just slammed it into your fucking chest. You don't want it. You're still content to go down this same path. And so one way to think about this too is in the concept of the show Intervention. It's a fascinating show if you've never seen it. It was on A&E quite a long time ago. I don't think they still make new episodes of that show. But intervention is a real thing that happens in families when they have a person in their family who has such a severe drug problem normally, or a drinking problem, that they have an intervention where the entire family comes together for sort of this group meeting. And what you're trying to do in that scenario is create a bottom. You're trying to, in one way or another, make it so that their life becomes worse because of this behavior. You're trying to rush them further down the path in hopes that they will encounter a scenario so bad they go, no, I don't want to do this anymore. You're trying to foster that bottom. It's controversial. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work at all. Depends on the person, really. Sometimes they'll just turn on the turbos and go 100 miles an hour down the path and they don't even look back. It's really person to person, and obviously you have to know the individual that you're dealing with before you come up with a strategy or a plan. But this is something in the psychology realm that's always fascinated me. This idea that whether it's somebody, let's just take a way simpler example, somebody who wants to just start working out, and they're being a little bullshitty with themselves. They might go to the gym and once a week and then talk about it a little bit more, maybe watch some YouTube videos, and then they order some protein powder, and then they get some supplements, and then they kind of sort of, maybe they'll get like a kettlebell or do something like that. But they never really pull the trigger. They never really actually do the hard shit that you're supposed to do. A lot of times, for me, I would define that as somebody who hasn't struggled enough with why you really want to do this in the first place. Well, it must not be that bad. It seems like when you look in the mirror and you see something you don't like, that you're vaguely annoyed, and that you don't like having a little bit of an extra gut, or you think, I would like to have a little bit more muscle here, or I would like to make my body look this way. I would like to feel a little bit better. But you're not at a rock bottom, right? I don't think so. I mean, you're not at some place where it's bad enough that you're actually going to make a dramatic change. At least that seems to be the reality that a lot of people operate within. Now, the weird thing about rock bottoms is that you don't have to get to yours. You don't have to go there. You can make a decision to turn around on whatever path you're on whenever you want. So whether it's something like a weight loss or getting in shape, or changing your diet, or just taking more personal responsibility over some tasks that you have in your life, setting new goals that are more difficult, or just improving yourself across the board, whatever that might be. You don't have to wait for things to get so shitty that you are overwhelmed with disappointment and anxiety and fear and then turn around and run the other direction. It doesn't have to go that way. For addicts and alcoholics, many times it does, but we're an extreme breed of people as well. So that's rock bottom. Number 3, the third thing that I learned in rehab is that you are not the most fucked up person here. There is always somebody who has it worse than you. And man, is this an easy point to land in an environment like rehab? Because even when you took the worst person there was one girl that had been to rehab 17 times, and she was like 20 years old. I mean, like 2 or 3 times a year since she was a preteen, she had been to rehab. There were people like that. There were people who were in their 70s. And at that age, it's almost like, who cares? They don't care. They're ready to die. They've made peace with this probably 40 years ago, right? I mean, there's always these people in these weird, dark situations that are just objectively way worse than whatever position you're in. And even if you took the worst person in the facility and said, man, that guy or that girl has it worse than everyone else, well, you can always just tell a story of somebody who was here a couple years ago. The staff would tell us these stories about people who had way crazier stories, right? People who had had come to rehab sort of like on a pending, manslaughter charge for DUI, things like that. Like they had crashed a car and killed kids, and they knew they were gonna spend years in jail, but they had to go to rehab before they actually got sentenced. There were those people. I mean, there were people who had their entire families completely disown them, and then they're in rehab. I mean, you name the scenario, and there was somebody that had been in that position. And this is such an important thing to keep in mind in the context of your entire life. Wherever you find yourself, whatever your position may be, sure, we can stack up how the world has oppressed you, how you have been victimized, how you have shit going on in your life that isn't fair. Life isn't fair. It's not even remotely fair at all. And if we were to play a game of who's a bigger victim, you very well might win. I don't know you. I don't know the shit that you have going on. It's probably a lot of stuff. Anybody you talk to, even the most stable, healthy person you can imagine, scratch a quarter inch below the surface and you'll find trauma and damage and horrible things that they've personally had to endure. But ultimately, if we were to survey the entire world, we could definitely find somebody worse off than you as an individual. Of course we could. We could find somebody in the same exact boat that you're in terms of their life setup, their environments, their scenario, their tragedies, and their damages and traumas, things that they've collected. We can find somebody in a very similar position, and they have an IQ score that's 20 points lower than yours, right? I mean, there's so many ways that you can spin this. And, a really helpful analogy that I'll borrow from one philosopher who we'll talk about a little later in this podcast, a guy named Sam Harris. He often pitches this argument that whatever position you find yourself in now, if I made it worse, how much money would you pay to get right back to where you are right now? And man, something about rehab and having these extreme contrasts of knowing your position, where you are in your life, and seeing someone else in a very different but objectively much worse position, man, it brings this clarity to your perspective that is difficult to attain on your own. Because nobody likes to seek out suffering necessarily. I think we do this on a political level all the time, but I think in our own personal lives, we tend to magnify our own suffering and not necessarily acknowledge that other people may have it just as bad, if not way, way worse than us. But when you begin to do that, when you begin to entertain that thought experiment that maybe my life isn't that bad, and let me look outside of here and assess, how have people had it historically, maybe even in other countries, in different parts of the world throughout human history? How has this life experiment gone in the past? You'll find that whatever you have going on now, especially if you live anywhere in the West, it is pretty fucking absurdly good in every measurable way. Now, the rehab analogy here is very direct, right? I mean, that's a very apples to apples kind of thing. I'm in rehab and I messed my own life up with substances. This person did the same thing, but they went even deeper down the same wormhole. But in reality, it is not about you playing the oppression or the victimhood Olympics. That's not what the game is necessarily. It's simply a matter of having perspective, to know that you as an individual have been dealt a certain set of cards to play. And no matter who you are, no matter what your set of cards is, somebody can give you a shittier hand. The universe can give you a horrible hand. And so this is, it leads you down this road of gratitude, where you wake up and count your blessings sort of mentality, right? To make a gratitude list. These are sort of fundamental psychological things that you can do in your life, and they're really, really beneficial. So rehab was very good at illustrating these extreme differences, just to realize that I'm not the worst person here, and even the worst person here isn't the worst person that's ever been here. It always gets worse, and maintaining that perspective beyond rehab has been really, really helpful for me. Thing number 4 that I learned at rehab is that not everyone wants to be in rehab. Not everyone chooses to do that sort of thing. And it's weird because everybody who didn't want to be there, if they were forced there by one of their lawyers because of a bad legal situation they got in, and their lawyer said, hey, you need to go to rehab. That happened to a few people. There's also people who came in on interventions, or who were just merely convinced, or they were just compliant when it came to the wishes of their husband or their wife or their family or their friends. There was a lot of people like that. It was really like half and half. And there was a very big difference between the people who had chosen to be in rehab and the people who didn't choose to be there for whatever reason. If you chose to be there, you were miles ahead of everybody else. Your motivation was tenfold. And a lot of this has to do with sort of this concept of personal responsibility. I'll give you another really easy example. This is kind of a very specific example, but I work with a company called 7 Friday. It's a watch company. And they have been very generous and given me many of their watches, which are pretty expensive. I've also bought several of their watches. Before I worked with them, I had purchased 2 or 3 of their watches, but they've given me some in exchange for creating a lot of different types of media for them. Some stuff you've seen on my drum channels, and others are just videos that I make and send them. But it's a really good relationship, good company. But I can tell you that my behavior when I wear the 7 Friday watches that I purchased is different than the behavior when I wear the 7 Friday watches that I didn't purchase. Because on the ones that I didn't purchase, well, they're worth about the same amount of money. This is the same monetary value in the world. But I didn't really invest my own money. So it makes me behave differently. I'm less careful with those watches, right? And it's not even conscious. It's just when I know that I am personally invested in this thing, it changes my behavior. Another really easy example for something like this would be going to the gym. If you pay for your own gym membership, you're likely to use it. If you have someone else paying for your gym membership, or maybe your Netflix account, things like that, you might not really care if a few months go by and you don't use it because you're not personally invested in this thing. And so the personal investment, taking personal responsibility over this action or this thing that you're doing, whatever it might be, when you put your chips in and you're the one who's invested in this thing, it changes things. It changes things on a psychological level that is really hard for me to articulate. And so in any scenario, whether it's going to rehab or going to the gym or something like that, buying a watch, I don't know, whatever analogy you want to come up with here, when you are able to put your money on the table, when you're able to take a personal level of responsibility and invest in something out of your own choosing, out of your own intent, that seems to make this massive, massive difference in the integrity of the act itself, right? The world sort of manipulates and contorts around your intentions sometimes. This is a philosophical path we could go down for quite a while, but I think I'll leave it just at this simple idea that personal responsibility and your own personal intention, when it comes to the actions in your life, the things that you're doing and involving yourself with, when your heart is in it, when your fucking gut is in it, it completely changes things. It's very different than doing something out of obligation or something that you would ultimately choose not to do if you could. Thing number 5 I learned at rehab, and this is a pretty simple one. One day at a time. One day at a time is it's rhetoric within Alcoholics Anonymous, and boy, is that a staple. You hear that phrase every goddamn day. There's no way around it. One day at a time, one day at a time. It's just a little anthem that they have in a lot of those meetings. And there is some weird validity to that. Now, I like to expand it a little bit further. And the way I see it is that when shit is going really, really bad, in the context of sobriety, let's just say you're freshly sober and you are freshly miserable, or at least miserable in a new way that you're not accustomed to. So that misery might not seem very sustainable. So if you think about being sober for 5 years, 10 years, the rest of your goddamn life, that's extremely difficult for you to even conceptualize. It makes the weight of sobriety get twice as heavy to frame your situation that way over that span of time. It's really not a healthy way to do it. And so as your misery or dissatisfaction with life becomes very high in these kind of scenarios, it's important that you shorten your outlook. So for me, at first, it's not about even one day at a time, because sometimes you can't imagine maintaining this state that I'm in of misery, being deeply unsatisfied or uncomfortable. You can't imagine maintaining that for another day. That sounds way too long. It sounds like an eternity. But can you do 20 minutes? Cool. 20 minutes is all we need. That's all we need. If you can't do 20 minutes, let's go 2 minutes. Can you do 2 minutes? Okay. If you can't do 2 minutes, let's go 8 seconds. How about 8 seconds? Can we count to 8? Right. So the more miserable you are, the shorter you have to go when it comes to sustaining yourself in whatever way that might be, mentally, physically, just to hang on to the fucking universe and to get through this. When things get really, really rough, it is vital that you shorten that time frame. And as you find stability in your life, whether that's in sobriety or recovery, or in some other dramatic change that you're trying to make in your life, it becomes more possible to lift your head up further and to see further out into the world. That becomes much more attainable of a state to be in, with your head lifted up, looking far out. Great example of this is like puppies. When you have a puppy, they see the world like 2.5 inches around their face. They look down a lot, they're smelling the ground, and they slam into shit, and they're not paying attention. And as they get older and mature, their chin lifts, their eye lifts, and they begin to see further out into the world. To me, this is how I define my recovery in a lot of ways, is that at a certain point, I could only look at what was immediately in front of me. It's the only thing worthy of my attention right now, because that's all I can bear to take on is the next 10 seconds or the next 5 minutes. But eventually, I can start making plans for next Friday, right? We're beginning to look out into the world and imagine ourselves sustained and balanced and stable, at least this week. At least this week, it seems I can do that. And then before you know it, you're able to look at a 5-year plan, which is something that an addict could never do in the depths of their addiction. 5 years, get the fuck out of here. I'm getting fucked up in 42 minutes. That's what's happening today. So when we say one day at a time, that's a simplified version of what it means to change your outlook of time, based off of where you are. Yeah, one day at a time is probably a solid way to say that, but it might be 10 minutes at a time, and as things get better, it doesn't necessarily have to be one day at a time. I have no problem now saying that I'll be sober for the next 6 weeks, whatever. It doesn't bother me to say that anymore, but that was an unbelievably difficult thing to say many years ago. So at a certain point, yeah, it was one day at a time, but I think that changes over time. And the 6th and final thing that I learned in rehab, at least just these main takeaways, I learned 1,000 things, but we don't have 1,000 hours to dive into each one. The final thing is that a community of recovering people is very powerful, because addiction in of itself is extremely isolating. Just sort of the name of the game, right? I think even when people have addictions that come with a social life, which happens a lot with alcohol, happens with Coke too. I mean, there are communities that spawn off of these people. There's a Coke subculture, and those people hang out and interact with each other. There's friendships and relationships that happen in there. Same with pot, same with alcohol. Every drug has their own little miniature subculture, like these little societies that break away. So you might have friends, and you might have your own localized culture that centers around that drug and those experiences. But ultimately, at the end of that path, it's really isolating. You can also be in a room full of people and still feel alone. That's a thing that happens in the depths of addiction, right? You're just at the bottom of this fucking pit. And even if other people jump in the pit with you, it's sort of like, you have this inability to connect with people on so many different ways. So when you're introduced to this new community in an environment like rehab, there is something special that happens. You begin to connect with people in ways that you haven't connected with people in a very long time. They're new connections, right? And so this would apply to anybody who, let's just take some easy examples like fitness and weight loss, which are really common goals where people want to make a dramatic change to improve themselves, do something differently than they've been doing it for a long time. I would say that something in the group fitness world would be very helpful. A community of people with sort of a shared goal would be very, very helpful. In terms of rehab and recovery, it was really helpful, man. It allowed me to connect with people where we could empathize with each other over this ideal that we were sharing a burden, right? We're all in this together, and even though you might feel deeply isolated, that feeling begins to peel away a little bit as you interact and converse with people who are sharing the same burden that you're sharing. So It's weird for me because I'm not like a group person. I don't like group fitness. I don't know why I would mention group fitness as an example. You would never catch me in a CrossFit class or a yoga class. I'll do those things at my house alone, but I absolutely hate, like, team sports. Can't do it. I'm way too individualistic to do any of that stuff. But I've got to give credit where it's due in that there's tremendous value in some of these communities of people who are recovering or taking on new skill sets or things like that. So that was a huge takeaway from rehab, that the community has value. You don't have to do this alone. And even if you're someone who's, maybe tackling sobriety or some version of recovery on your own, going to like an AA meeting might be a good idea for you. You don't have to buy into the doctrine necessarily. This is a view I've tried to have over church before. Church is a cool ass place to go. I'm not a Christian. I don't buy any of this doctrine. As a matter of fact, I would probably be, I've been to church in fucking 10 or 15 years, but I would be cringing in my seat, wanting to merely debate all of the philosophical flaws that I find within a particular belief system. That seems like a real waste of my time. I'm not going to go there and be deeply uncomfortable for no reason. But the concept of going to a community of people with shared values to talk about shit that you all agree is good for you, man, that is unbelievably valuable. For me, that's just localized to a friends group is what that is. I think an excellent church experience for somebody who's non-religious in any way would be sit on a porch with a bunch of friends, have a cookout. That's what church is, right? It's the same shit. It's shared values in a community of people. And man, that is something that is just objectively good. It's an awesome thing to have in your life. So whether in the context of rehab, going to church, or barbecuing on your back porch, communities are very powerful. And this was something that I really learned at rehab. So now let's talk about rejoining the world. When I got out of rehab, one of the most clear mistakes that I made is that I came home and I immediately began dating this girl that I had met only a couple weeks before I went to rehab. And she knew the situation, obviously. She actually watched my dog, Snitch, when he was alive. She watched him while I was gone for those 3 months. And we wrote a lot of letters, talked on the phone every once in a while. We weren't dating, but it was just a long distance, more of like a friend kind of sort of thing. And I got back from rehab, and then we started dating. And I'm not going to give you the whole spiel on that particular relationship. This was a very long time ago. But I can tell you that dating anybody was a bad idea in that sort of situation. And this reaches, or rather this concept spans a lot further than recovery in of itself, though I would have that specific message for somebody entering recovery. Do not fucking date anybody. You are not ready to do that. It is time to focus on you. And with that said, if you are in any phase of your life where you are focusing on yourself, you're making dramatic changes, and you're working towards self-improvement and taking personal responsibility over things that you've struggled with in the past, you really shouldn't involve anybody else in that process. And this stings. It stings a lot because I certainly used this girl as somewhat of a crutch when I got out of rehab. I would share a lot of my thoughts and feelings with her. And there were definitely some benefits there. It's nice to be close with somebody and to sort of, share your burden a little bit with someone who's understanding and helpful. But it merely slows down the process of you ultimately assuming all of the responsibility here and bearing this entire burden yourself, which is the only fucking way to do it. You can't share your hard shit with other people necessarily, not until you get your own foundation set up. And then I suppose in the situation of a life partner or a marriage, you sort of merge your foundations together, but you can't have a half-built foundation and be with somebody who also has somewhat of a half-built foundation and call that a full foundation. In my eyes, you need to be supremely stable, independent, and ultimately happy and content with your life and how things are going before you involve another person. So anybody in this sort of position, don't date people. It's not the time to date. There are times to date people and times not to. And there are anecdotal examples where this may have worked out just fine for some people. But in my case, in hindsight, with 10 years of experience now, that was a major mistake I made coming out of rehab. So stay single if you're really, really going to town on yourself. That sounded like a jacking off joke. If you're really, really working hard on who you are as a person, don't be with anybody in that phase. I think it's vital. I'd love to expand on this down the road. I'm not going to get sucked into a relationship game at this point of the podcast, but be single in those phases. It's very important. Another weird thing about rejoining the world that you will find out of rehab is that your addictive tendencies can resurface sometimes. You will definitely, it's like playing whack-a-mole at times with certain behaviors. So a weird example of this you could find with anybody in any situation would be that you have, like, you stop smoking cigarettes, let's say. That was the mole that you smashed. But another one's going to pop up somewhere, and all of a sudden you find yourself, I don't know, like having too many beers on the weekend. It could be anything like that, where you sort of crush one behavior, but you see another one sort of pop up. For me, this is like just a symptom of not fully understanding the problem that you may have, right? Another great example of this is when people like participate in this like hookup culture or way of thinking in rehab, because we take away their drug of choice and then all of a sudden they have to have this other outlet, this other relatively destructive behavior sort of emerges from their psyche. And it's not that they were both sexually promiscuous and doing drugs before they came here. No. The sexual promiscuity is brand new, and it's a new behavior that emerges when you take away one of the other behaviors that they had. And so I saw some of these things happen with me, but it's just something to be aware of as you begin to make positive changes in your life. As you remove one vice, it seems to be kind of common that you'll watch other ones pop up. And in my mind, that means that you need to dig a little bit deeper in terms of your own psychology or perhaps your own philosophy to identify your problem in a more clear, articulate way. Because when you really dig the problem out at its root, oftentimes, that's the way that you eliminate these alternative behaviors. So anyway, just something to keep in mind. Sometimes when you remove one behavior, you'll see another one pop up. And to me, that's merely a sign that you need to dig deeper in terms of identifying the problem and truly rooting that thing out of your psychology. Now, undoubtedly, in my experience coming out of rehab when I was back here in Orlando and had been out for, several months really, I experienced what you call like a dry drunk syndrome, in that I was sober, I didn't drink, but man, I wasn't very happy. I wasn't content. And I thought about alcohol all the time. I sort of thought about it in terms of kind of like a breakup, and that it was just this thing that I missed. I would reminisce about it like, man, remember when it used to be this way? Remember when times were better, right? And I had this glorification of alcohol sort of happening in my own mind, and that was very, very unhealthy. And I was in therapy. Therapy is something I recommend to everybody, even when shit's going great. Therapy's awesome. But I was in therapy with a counselor named Clark, cool guy, and he definitely helped me process a lot of those feelings and sort of work through them. But ultimately, the only way that I crawled out of that pit of being a dry drunk or just being an alcoholic who happened to not be drinking, the only way I got out of that was by digging down into philosophy to answer larger questions, way more difficult questions that have answers that are deeply debatable and have been debated for literally all of human history. And there is an argument that ignorance is bliss. I think this is something that some people seem to find, where the answer to them finding long-term stability might not be rooted in philosophy. That is extremely hard for me to understand. But I think there are some people who, for better or for worse, don't give a shit about that. And for them, finding stability might be something far simpler that's not even philosophical as they would perceive it. It might just mean meeting the right person. It might be getting a job that you like. And it might not, at least in their own mind, ever go any deeper than that. And in a weird way, I'm envious of people like that. If you never had to think about philosophy to find stability, holy shit, am I jealous? I'm deeply jealous of that. It is a burden sometimes to be someone who even cares about philosophy. Anybody who is of a philosophical mindset will tell you that, because you have to confront the most horrible shit that anybody could ever confront, that life is ultimately tragic, that you and everyone you know and love will die, that life is perpetually unsatisfactory and filled with suffering, that we don't truly know why we're here or why any of this means anything. I mean, these are deeply painful questions to wrestle with, and they are psychologically challenging for a lot of people. Well, they're challenging for anybody who cares to entertain them. But if you're somebody who, for any variety of reasons, has never cared to entertain them, and you're happy with where you are and whatever your systematic belief is, maybe you don't even need one. Maybe you just have a couple of simple mantras that seem to get you through the day. I'm jealous because I don't know what that's like. And that level of simplicity sounds blissful. It really, really does. But, got to play the set of cards that you're dealt. And I was dealt a far more fucking complex set of cards sometimes. So in therapy, digging into some of these philosophies and different questions that I had about the world, keep in mind, in absence of Christianity, it was really the sole motivator for digging into some of these new philosophies, was trying to gather or rather build a belief system underneath me that could support me. In trying to do that, I stumbled across one particular philosophy which dramatically changed everything for me. It was similar to like the psilocybin and God story. It was like one of those rare moments of like everything's different after that fucking thing happened. And what I had read was an excerpt from a philosophical paper that Albert Camus had wrote. Albert Camus was a French philosopher, written several books that were well known, and this particular work that he had written was about his existential philosophy, which is that of absurdism. Now, I can't remember in great detail exactly how this particular document was worded, but if you look up anything to do with Albert Camus' absurdism or the philosophy of absurdism, you will find very similar definitions to the ones that I'm going to offer you today. So for me, the way that I like to describe absurdism is that you have to first define what is the absurd. So the absurd is a pill that you have to swallow. Everybody has to swallow this pill. It's just up to you how you're going to swallow it, right? So the pill is the fact that you are smart enough to ask questions that you are not smart enough to ever answer. The way that Albert Camus originally pitched this is that in a world that is meaningless, we somehow still have this innate desire to find meaning in it. And I suppose it would be quite debatable whether, if you believe that the world is inherently meaningless. It is certainly true that to find meaning, that's easier for some people than others. Some people spend their entire lives looking for it and never find it. Someone who has found meaning might very well say, well, I had it the whole time and this person just couldn't find what that meaning was. And you guys can go off in a corner and debate that for all I care. Not necessarily the path I want to go down today, which is why I like to alter the phraseology of this philosophy. And that is to say that you're smart enough to ask about shit that you're not smart enough to ever answer. You can't answer the questions that you're smart enough to ask. And that is quite cruel. It's quite cruel to be in a world where that's the case. In a lot of ways, it's the root of the eternal suffering that is life. You can ask questions that you'll never figure out, ever figure out. And that's painful. It's very, very painful. More painful for some people than others. And, I think in many ways you could say that the mission of your life is to try and solve as many of those questions as you can, right? That's a pretty vague statement, but trying to get to the bottom of those difficult to answer questions. Some of them you will never get to the bottom of. Now, you might convince yourself of a personal belief or philosophy that is adequate for you, but you're not solving this question for all of humanity. You are solving it on a personal level. And in many ways, that's all you ever can do. But remember, this is much harder for some people than others. So for somebody who absolutely cannot answer the question of why am I here? Why am I here? That's the question. And you have somebody who has entertained Christianity. They reject it. They've entertained Islam. They reject it. They've entertained Scientology. They reject it. They've entertained atheistic reason. They reject it. They still can't find meaning. Why am I here? This is a question that they simply cannot answer for themselves, and it's driving them absolutely crazy. Well, in this writing, the way Albert Camus would describe this is that they are unable to swallow the pill that is the absurd, right? They can't wrestle with this idea that you're never going to fucking solve that problem. You're never going to answer that question. But welcome to life. You have to swallow this pill. You have to deal with that. You gotta move on in some capacity, or at least find a way to live with this pill in the back of your throat, even if you can't swallow it. You gotta find a way forward. So Albert Camus' suggestion, which is not one that I'm giving you today, not one that I would recommend to anybody who's at all unstable. His suggestion was, if you can't swallow that pill, if you can't find a way to move forward in the world and to progress forward with this irony in the universe, then you should kill yourself to get out of the way of everyone else who is trying to do so. That is fucking brutal. That is savage. What a thing to tell somebody. That, hey, if you're struggling with the nature of your existence, the purpose of your life, the meaning of your life, and you can't figure it out, then how about you escort yourself off of the planet so other people can? God damn, that is a savage message, man. And when I read that, it helped me tremendously. Now, given I'm a relatively extreme person, I think about uncomfortable things all the time. I think about death all the time. Really, since that moment, death has been a major motivating factor. Because if I'm not spinning the wheels, if I'm not pressing the gas, I do still ask myself the question, why should I still be here? Shouldn't I get out of the way? If I'm not moving forward, if I'm not contributing to this world we live in, if I'm not helping anybody, and I'm just writhing in my own agony and bullshit, why shouldn't I get out of the way? I'm not here to tell you that I wake up and contemplate suicide. This is more of a philosophical thought experiment that is worth your time going through. You know, if you can't figure out how to swallow that pill, your value to this planet is in question. It is in question. And that's not me telling you that you don't have any value. It's telling me that you need to do something, that you need to push the gas here. We need to start working towards how to get this fucking pill down our throat. Again, what is the pill? The pill that is the absurd states that you're smart enough to ask questions that you're never going to figure out. You're not smart enough to solve them. And you have to deal with that. I know that fucking sucks. I almost killed myself over it by drinking myself to death. You know, I get it. Don't get me wrong. I understand that's a dark, horrible message. Now, for some people, the answer could be as simple as Christianity. It could be as simple as a fucking men's group, or like a social group, or some new community. Sometimes the answer can be really simple. It doesn't have to be complex. For me, it was very, very complex. And so to sum up, my answer, I suppose, contribution is really where I find a lot of my value. That's how I move past the absurd in some ways, is that, well, if my alternative is to kill myself, which in the thought experiment it would be, right, of absurdism. If that's my alternative, the least that I can do is contribute something to the world. And yes, I can contribute to individuals, and I can contribute to my family and my neighbors and, sort of my localized community. But I also like the idea of contributing to the entire planet, to leave something here so that other people may suffer less than me. Now, in the context of this podcast, it would be sharing philosophies, insights, worldviews, lessons that I've learned in hopes that I can alleviate your suffering, or maybe that I can just save you some goddamn time so you can enjoy your life a little bit more. That sounds like a fantastic way to spend my time. And if my time is ultimately meaningless, well, if there's nothing I can do about that, I suppose making your meaningless time a little bit more enjoyable, that seems worth my time, I guess, And maybe the sun will just burn us all into 1,000 fucking pieces, and that's fine. That's fine. But if I improved your experience and subsequently improved my experience by feeling fulfilled about helping you, man, I really don't know what a better way forward is. I don't know what's a better solution than that. And it sounds like a goal that I can live with, a goal that is sustainable. Now, there were some questions at the end of this podcast that we're about to get into that we'll sort of draw out a little bit more of some of these philosophical concepts. But for me, the value of contribution, how I value my contribution to the world, is one of the things that has allowed me to swallow the pill that is the absurd. And then at the same time, I still frantically make attempts all the time, every single day, to dig deeper for answers, potential answers to some of these philosophical problems. Ones that I'm well aware I'm not smart enough to ever answer, but I'm fucking smart enough to ask them. So I find myself in that loop constantly, and I'm content to keep digging. I think I'm going to dig for the rest of my life. Welcome to philosophy, right? All right, so in going down the absurdism wormhole, I've definitely covered some things that were going to be in this third section. But one more thing here in this idea of rejoining the world, and that is that I would highly recommend a full year of sobriety before you experiment with any type of moderate other drug use, whether that be smoking weed or psychedelics or things that are notoriously, non-addictive, even just a drug that's not your drug of choice. Be careful with that shit, man. Give it a year or so. I smoked weed just a little bit under a year after I was out of rehab. And admittedly, I suppose you could call that a dangerous thing to do. But weed will not ruin your life. Objectively, that would just be a very silly thing to say. And I don't regret doing that, but I think I could have gone even longer without smoking, that's for sure. Anyway, just something to keep in mind if you're at all entertaining this idea of becoming sober or just making a dramatic change, like, let's say, diet, another great example. Fuck desserts for a year. Leave that off of your table, off of your plate for a year, right? Acclimate to this completely new scenario, this new lifestyle in many ways, and then begin to experiment with that stuff a little bit down the road. I just think you need to find a really strong baseline before you test the waters right away. So in the context of sobriety, a full year before you entertain anything, even in the psychedelic realm, which are completely non-addictive, but mushrooms, acid, DMT, fucking mescaline, pot, any of that stuff. And then obviously I would recommend stay far away from things that are purely rooted in escapism, which would be like your opiates or coke or things like that. Just keep all of that stuff away from you for at least a year. Trust me, you will need that amount of time to really get your footing, and drugs just aren't going to serve you in this window of time. Okay, so now on to long-term stability. These are the more overarching philosophies that have really held my shit together. And absurdism certainly plays a lot into that, though I wouldn't describe that as my sole philosophy about the world. It's just one that had a lot of value in that it was a major turning point in my own personal philosophy. But it's not the only thing that has kept the boat floating, So another huge one is the value of honesty and internal truth. And this is something where, ironically, a belief in a higher power actually serves you here. Because if you believe that there is a God, omnipresent creator of the universe, whatever, it doesn't have to be the Christian God, just any higher power, something bigger than you that you are in one way or another accountable for, what that comes with is you realize that you can't get away with anything. If there's something that knows your thoughts, a God that knows your thoughts, let's just say, well, you can't even get away with shit in your own mind. You can't even lie to yourself. Right? You can't be deceptive even internally because something else knows your thoughts. And when you hold yourself to that accountability, that level of accountability, I think a lot of times it fosters this internal truth and honesty, which is really, really a good fucking thing that everybody needs a lot more of. So for me, to have a true picture of what my relationships to certain substances are, it has been vital that I maintain a very high level of honesty with myself about how those relationships are going. So, pot would be a really, really good example where there's a list of pros, like good things in my life that happen when I smoke weed, and there's a list of cons. There are things that are just not that good. And man, it is really easy to be deceptive with yourself about that list. It's really easy to say, to justify doing certain behaviors in your own mind. But when you are truly, truly seeking an internal, honest debate with yourself about what you're doing and why you're doing it, what's good for you and what's not good for you, which behaviors you should pursue, which ones you should totally eliminate. When you're having that honest discussion in your own mind, man, you will find some real meaning and happiness there. So in a variety of different contexts, having a truthful monologue or even a dialogue in your own mind with two avatars of yourself, if you're arguing an idea, right? Having a truthful conversation within your own mind is vital to finding happiness and meaning. You have to be truthful with yourself. If you're lying to yourself, that's the worst person you could lie to. It's way worse than lying to somebody else, right? So the value of honesty and truth, even on an internal level, it is supremely important. It is one of the things that has kept me grounded over the last 10 years, to just be truthful with myself. I would lie to someone else before I lied to myself. And I think that is, it's unbelievably important to me. I don't know how else to say it. Fucking tell the truth to yourself. Don't lie to you. Now, also in this category of long-term stability is really just the overarching idea of philosophy. And again, I understand this may not be true for everybody, but I do think that in finding long-term stability for your life, that you should in some capacity be seeking to answer questions that are difficult to answer. That might be as specific as you need to go if you're not someone who is philosophically minded. But I do think it's important to be able to frame a structure around your own beliefs. Because if you believe something, let's just say that you had a belief system or a structure of belief that was not true. It was just false. Well, somebody can walk up and just flick like the toothpicks out from underneath your fucking belief, and all of a sudden, everything that you stand for, that you've built your life on, can crumble underneath you. And so, in order to make sure that that doesn't happen, I'm a firm believer that you should dig into your own personal beliefs about the world, no matter how deep or shallow those may be, and truly find a way to defend them. Do you know the counter argument? Because there are certainly some people who would assess your beliefs and say, well, those are bullshit. Okay, well, do you know where they're coming from? You can think they're wrong. Nothing wrong with that. But you should know their argument. You should have some sort of defense mounted for your own beliefs about the world. I think this is it's just a safe way to approach any philosophy that you want to adopt. Have some ability or some capacity to defend what it is that you believe. And that means going and digging a little bit deeper. There's a lot of directions we could go with that, and maybe we'll go into it a little bit further in this podcast. But in long-term stability, the importance of defending your own belief system, incredibly important for me. Another thing I wanted to mention here in long-term stability is this idea of sharing your story and being really, really open. And I think one thing that bothers me a lot is when people talk about rough things in their life, traumas, damage they've collected, just whatever, catastrophes, horrible things that happen to all of us at some point, right? When people discuss those things and they are merely a sentence or oftentimes a word away from tears. I'm well aware that there are some things that are very difficult to touch with your mind without becoming emotional. I've got many things like that. I've cried in like half of these fucking podcasts. I get it. I totally get it. But I think sometimes the level of sensitivity that people walk around with, I think sometimes it's unhealthy. I think sometimes people keep things in to a degree that doesn't serve them at all. And I think in many ways being vocal about your struggles can help alleviate them a lot of times. And this is just really a great argument for counseling, right? To go and share your struggles with somebody who can not only empathize with you, because you certainly need that, but also someone who can give you objective advice or perhaps a better perspective on how bad that thing is or actually isn't. So for me, when it comes to the things that I truly struggle with, I always make an effort to be really open about them. When it's rehab, I have no problem telling somebody that I just met, hey, I don't drink. I went to rehab 10 years ago, so it's not my thing. Doesn't bother me. I've said that to total strangers like many, many, many times. And I think it's healthy for me to do that. It normalizes it for me. And it also sort of alleviates the burden. I'm not keeping a secret Hey, raise your fucking hand. I suck at this thing. I suck at this thing. Me, I'm the guy. I suck at this thing. Get that shit out of the way, I also think, when I lost Snitch earlier this year, or I'm sorry, last year at this point, one of the reasons that I think I handled that better than other people may handle, losing a loved one, a dog, or a family member, whatever it is, right? I think one of the reasons that I handled that a little bit better is that I leaned into all of those emotions. I didn't stuff them down. If it's time to be sad, then let's be fucking sad. If I wake up and there were several days like this, I would wake up within a week or two of when we had buried him here in the backyard. I just woke up crying, and I had to come to the backyard, and I sat on his grave, this little flower box that I had built, and I would just sit there and cry and talk to him. It's a lot easier to say, no, not going to think about it. I'm going to make some coffee, and then I'm going to do this, and I'm going to play on my phone, and I'm going to fuck around. Man, that's easy to do. That's really easy to do. But making the conscious decision to lean in to those uncomfortable emotions, to be vulnerable with yourself and to be vulnerable with other people, right? To share your burdens, to share your struggles, and not stuff them down within you somewhere. God damn, that's the way to go, man. It's definitely the way to go. I don't like the idea that, I said this earlier in this podcast, if you take a seemingly stable and healthy person and you scratch below the surface like a quarter inch and you find all this bullshit, I like the idea that, maybe you'd have to dig a little bit deeper in me or within you to find some of that bullshit. I like the idea that you and I could actively expel some of that ugliness, to bury as little as possible within ourselves, to be supremely vulnerable, supremely open, right? Perpetually forfeiting all of our uncomfortable thoughts and burdens to the world. Let them go. Let them go. Talk about them. Share them. You don't have to struggle in silence so much of the time. So for me, being vocal about my problems, being vocal about things that I suck at, being vulnerable when it comes to telling people about, shit that I'm not good at or shit that's hard in my life. It ends up serving me more than anybody else. It's one of the reasons that I do it. So even as an introvert, here I am. This is probably hour 8 or something of this podcast. I'm telling you, man, let that stuff go. It helps a lot. Another huge thing that I found has been helpful in my long-term stability out of rehab is preemptive decision making. And I do have an analogy for you here, but we'll start in the context of alcoholism. So for me, I don't ever want to put myself in a position where I know I will absolutely want to drink and trust myself to say no in that environment. The move has to be made much sooner than that. So for me, an example of this would be going to a show or going to a bar, some environment like that. I have to decide before I get there that I'm not drinking. Now, this is not something I have to do now, but it was something I had to do many years ago. And sometimes that meant not going to the show at all. Sometimes it meant calling the venue and asking if they did alcoholic wristbands there and then putting my name on a list to make sure I couldn't get one. There's another weird move that you can do. Alcoholics do this right out of rehab. When you get on a plane, you immediately have a note written in your hand and you give it to the first flight attendant that you see. And that note says, "My name is Adam. I sit in this seat. I'm a recovering alcoholic, and under no circumstances should you give me alcohol on this flight." Right? Because what you're doing is you're not trusting yourself 2 hours into the flight when you're bored as shit and maybe you get a text message that makes you uncomfortable, right? So it's preemptive decision making. So I'll give you a couple other analogies of ways that you can do this in your life that are super helpful. Trust yourself to make good nutritional decisions at the grocery store. Don't trust yourself at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday when you're sitting on the couch and you're wondering whether or not you should go get that extra bowl of cereal, right? Out of the fridge. If it's not in the fucking fridge and you made the healthy decision earlier this week, then you've made this 10 times easier for yourself, right? And the final example I'll use is when it comes to being monogamous in a relationship and not cheating on your partner. I'll say this, speaking to men directly. Dude, your dick is so untrustworthy. Don't trust that thing. Are you kidding? Are you kidding? Every fiber of your being, your entire biological structure is telling you to go have sex with somebody all the time. And there is nothing you can do about the fact that even as a married man, right, that when a beautiful woman walks by, dude, come on. Of course you don't become unattracted to people when you get married or when you're in a relationship. That's just not how it works. So one of the most important things that you can do, if your intention is to maintain monogamy in a relationship, is to not put yourself in an environment where, for a lack of better words, you have to trust your dick. Don't do that. He's pretty untrustworthy for the most part, right? The decision has to be made earlier. You have to set yourself up for success by making healthy decisions when it is easy to make them. And in this case, the earlier the decision can be made, the easier of a decision it is to make. Don't wait until you're in the trenches to try and make difficult decisions. That is just a recipe for failure. And my final point here on long-term stability after rehab is that ultimately your sobriety belongs to you. Your lifestyle belongs to you. However you want to organize yourself in the world, whatever your daily schedule looks like, whatever habits you want to take on, in whatever order you want to take them on in, it's all up to you. It's all on you. It's one of the reasons why, in my eyes, like all philosophies lead back to individualism, is that there is no template I can hand you. There is no system anyone can hand you that will solve the problems that you have, because your problems belong to you, and therefore your solutions must belong to you as well. There are all sorts of wonderful hybridized lifestyles that seem to work for some people but would never work for somebody else. To me, this applies very much to things like diet. I'm on a very specific diet. I haven't eaten anything but effectively eggs and red meat in a year, just under a year. Dude, I'm not here to tell you that's how to eat. I have numerous friends who are vegans. I wouldn't tell you that's how to eat either, right? I think it is your journey as an individual. It is your mission to find out what diet is optimal for you. I don't get to tell you what that is. Now, there's some universal truths like, hey, maybe not Twinkies and McDonald's 5 days a week. I think we could say that's a fair assumption, but for the most part, all of these variables within your life, what you eat and if you work out and what hobbies you want to pursue and the value you place on family and your relationships and the personal integrity that you want to apply to your work. How many hobbies do you want to have? How much free time versus how much contribution and production? What are your personal philosophies? Are you satisfied with Christianity? Whatever this whole spread is, it all belongs to you. And so in the context of sobriety, that belongs to you too. You get to draw every line within this motherfucker, every single line that there could be drawn of what's acceptable to you and what's not. Where are your boundaries? What are the rules? Yes, you should gather insight from other people who have done this before. You certainly should do that. But ultimately, this is yours. This whole life is yours. Your lifestyle, your sobriety, all of it. It's all yours. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. All right, so now we're going to take a few questions. First one here is from brother Nate Testa. I've known Nate for quite a while. I met him, I feel like more than once. He was at a masterclass of mine years ago, down a little closer to South Florida. Anyway, we got a voicemail from Nate. Let's check it out.
What's up, Adam? It's Nate Testa from Orlando. I just wanted to say, dude, I know I commented on a couple of posts and everything, but the amount of value a person's story gives is absolutely powerful. And for you to be willing to talk about the struggles, talk about what you've been through over the 30 years of your life, and you haven't even gotten, what's crazy is you haven't even gotten, probably half of it, you've only been given portions or aspects of your personality, of your life. And I just think that's so valuable and amazing. And that's really all I can say. Honestly, I just listened to episode, I don't know what episode you're on, but it's part 2 of the rehab. And honestly, it was a very powerful podcast. I don't say that much about podcasts. Dude, keep doing this. I think it's going to help a lot of people. And it's really giving me a lot of perspective as being a normie, like you say, a lot of perspective. Man, it's all that's so powerful. Very interesting stuff, and I'm definitely excited to hear more. But, dude, have a great weekend. Have a great week up ahead, and hopefully I talk to you soon.
Hey, thank you, Nate. I really appreciate it, brother. I know you've supported my drum stuff for a very long time, and you're a supporter of this podcast. Man, thank you for that support, brother. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you for the message. You know, it's really fun for me to hear from people who are normies, as we call them, right? Or people who are non-addicts that can't imagine why somebody would ever want to get fucked up all the time. But I think first of all, you said, the value of somebody sharing their personal story is like indescribable, right? It's huge. And I'm glad you feel that way, man, because I feel the same way. And it really doesn't matter what the story is. But, it's a fun thought experiment to like be in traffic and look out at a sea of cars, hundreds of cars, and know that in every single one of those cars, there's somebody with a story, with a life that is just as nuanced and complex and as fucked up as yours, right? It's unbelievable to think that's how the world works. There's so many stories, so many people. And so I'm glad that you find value in somebody else's personal story, because I'm aware that there's a sprinkle of ego over this whole podcast, and that it's me talking about myself. And I'm doing so under the presumption that you're going to find this interesting, or that there's some value in my own words. I selfishly hope there is, but I don't get to tell you that. So I'm really appreciative of your message, Nate, and not only your message, but your support and really your open-mindedness. Because if I'm not mistaken, Nate's a Christian, and I really didn't expect Christians to deeply entertain this podcast because, as I mentioned all the way back in episode 1, I'm not a Christian. I would happily debate that philosophy in many capacities, and it is refreshing to hear that there are Christians that are wholly unoffended by that position. That's my kind of Christian, right? I also find some ironies in that as well. We'll save those for another day. I'm not here to attack anybody. But man, Nate, thank you for the message, brother. I really appreciate the support. And also in another message you had sent on Instagram, sorry, I didn't respond to that one because I figured I would just respond to this one, but he said he was switching his vet over to Dr. Patina over at, I said it was Kirkpatrick Vet. It's now called Sodo Vet. Yeah, I think that's what it's called. Soto Veterinarian. Anyway, tell Dr. P I said, what's up, Nate? I'm glad you're going there, brother. He's an awesome guy, and you're an awesome guy. Thank you for your support, man. Next up, we got a text message from Garrett. He texted the hotline. He says, hey, Adam, my name is Garrett. I started learning the drums from quarantine last year. Oh, dude, so you're like a year into learning drums. Cool, man. He said, I stumbled onto your channel, an online community you've created, I assume in the drum world still. And he said, I love the podcast and looking forward to it every week. Well, thank you, sir. He says, you seem to have familiarity with a lot of philosophers and psychologists from the past. Do you have a favorite philosopher? What are your thoughts on philosophical modes of being, such as Stoicism or holistic psychology? I would love to hear your thoughts on these subjects. Sure, man. So first of all, I'll tell you that my answer might be a bit frustrating here because we're so early in this podcast. I don't want to give you some of my more extreme views that I might have. And I do have some that might fall into the category of extreme within our current political culture, I guess. But I'm not really here to share those with you today. So I'm going to give you a little bit more of like the philosophical straddler approach, which is sort of valuing everybody's side at once. And I do think that is the correct road to go down. So, let's take some really wide philosophical stances here. Let's compare Eastern philosophy to Western philosophy, right? Where Eastern philosophy would be much more along the lines of mindfulness, of not getting sucked up into the trap of Western society, right? To be supremely productive and to work hard, and corporations and money, acquisition of wealth, living for a future version of yourself instead of living for the you right now. So I'm a believer that you need to explore both of those philosophies. You need to understand the value of each one, because in my mind, it is very much a hybrid of those two approaches to life. You can call it the spectrum of like tactical artistry, episode 2. Very similar to that, right? There's always two sides to something. One will be a little bit colder, more tactical and utilitarian, and one will oftentimes be more empathetic and driven by emotion and love and things like that. And I think you need to explore both sides of that spectrum. So when it comes to Eastern versus Western philosophy, I certainly see value in both. I can tell you that I lean a lot closer towards Western society, which would value the family unit, being productive, contribution, right, and sort of the social structures that come with that way of thinking. Even though Eastern philosophy is phenomenal at promoting internal well-being on an individualistic level, but I think that in and of itself is very compatible with Western philosophy as well. So when it comes to specific philosophers, it's really hard for me to give you one. I do not have one that would be my favorite, but I can tell you that I am a fan of the current modern intellectual dark web club, which would be everything from Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and then on the conservative side, that would be it would be Shapiro, it would be Rubin. And I can also listen to people like David Pakman or fucking Ezra Klein or Matthew Iglesias or people that are far left-leaning. Even Sam Harris would be far left-leaning, right? I entertain all of these philosophies, all the way to Ben Shapiro, because I'm a believer that whatever philosophy you want to personally adopt, it's vital that you understand the contrasting philosophy, because there are undoubtedly arguments against this belief. If there are none, well, then we're done, right? Then there's no reason to have a conversation. If the view that you hold about the world is just supremely accurate and there are no rational arguments that could be pitched against it, well, it sounds like you beat the game. And that's not, I don't know what game you're playing, but that's not how philosophy works at all. So for me, it is of great value to explore contrasting philosophical arguments or philosophical positions. So one of the best examples of this, if you've never been introduced to this world of philosophical debate, a fantastic way to get into it is really Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, those two specific philosophers, because Sam Harris comes from far more of the reason side of the aisle. Everything can be ultimately answered with science if we were to go far enough in time, right? Using reason and logic, we will eventually unpack the mysteries of the universe. And those modes of thinking to be supremely rational and logistical, that ultimately that would answer every question if we just stayed the course. Somebody like Jordan Peterson would place a much higher value on something like mythology or the archetypal stories from religions, in that there's an irony to the world, or rather to the scientific study of the world, and that is that science will tell you why something is, but not what it ought to be, right? Another way to say that is that science doesn't answer every fucking question that we have. It just doesn't. A person in the position of Sam Harris might say, well, not yet, but it certainly could, and ultimately it will. And somebody like Jordan Peterson would say, no, that's not the reality, that there are things about this world that we are completely incapable of understanding outside of mythological analogies, outside of archetypal stories, which can paint pictures that we need, at least historically we seem to have need to understand some of the potential answers to these questions. So effectively, this is like science versus religion is what the debate is at its core, but it's much more complex than that. Also, both of those guys are infinitely smarter than I am, with vocabularies that are 10 times bigger. So I'll leave some of those discussions to them. But I would say that those two have been fascinating ones for me to dive into, for sure. Both have podcasts that are tremendously successful. We're talking millions of listeners each, and they are on very different sides of the spectrum. So I'll give you those two if you're curious about some of my own personal philosophies. I definitely steal from both of those guys individually. Now, there are philosophies that aren't so directly married to like existentialism or some of those harder questions about like morality and life itself. You know, not everything is there. There's also economic philosophy, which is a fascinating one. So in that case, you know, I'll give you a great podcast to go listen to. It would be one that's between Matthew Iglesias, who is a very liberal writer for Vice News, a notoriously hyper left-leaning news outlet. Ben Shapiro, who runs one of the largest conservative shows in the entire world. They did a podcast together, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating hearing the free market capitalist argument from a very articulate person pitched against someone who just wrote a book talking about how, you know, effectively having 1 billion Americans is his strategy for how we can strengthen our economy and compete on a global market. Two very, very different approaches. They have different approaches to how they could set up taxes. Even Andrew Yang's podcast with Ben Shapiro is well worth a listen, because you're talking about two articulate, intelligent people that come from unbelievably different backgrounds. They have different perspectives. They look at the same problem and come up with two totally contrasting ways to solve the problem. And each one of them is worthy of your time. Hear out their argument from start to finish. Don't be offended by what they say. If they have an idea that's absolutely asinine, that's okay. A lot of people have stupid ass ideas. How about you come up with a better one, and there you go. That's how we move forward in the world, right? So when it comes to all things philosophy, I'm not one to put myself in a box very quickly. There are certainly some philosophical boxes that I'm so comfortable in that I will defend them. I will defend them no problem. I don't entertain the counter arguments anymore because I've gone there, I've explored the counter argument, and I found a bunch of bullshit. And now my original, or at least this side of the argument, is the one where I find myself. I do have many philosophies that are that way, but I always try to revisit them, open shit back up, and just see if I'm wrong. It's the nature of having a philosophical discussion. Really, the axiom of that is, are you willing to entertain that you could be wrong? If you're not, then you are ultimately unable to have a philosophical discussion anyway. So, back to the drawing board for you, I guess. But this is a great question, Garrett. Honestly, I could do 100 hours on different philosophies because we haven't even touched some of the subcategories or not even subcategories, the main categories of philosophy, which would be, the concept of free will, all sorts of human origin stories. I mean, good God, this is just too deep for us to dive into today. But I enjoy in these earlier episodes, in the first 10 or 20 episodes, sort of scratching the surfaces on some of these things and then gauging your feedback. Do you guys enjoy going down some of these wormholes? Is there one that particularly interests you more than another? Because if it was, let's just say, free will, I'm down to go down the free will wormhole, but we're going to need a couple hours. So, yeah, really good question, Garrett. Thank you, man. All right, we got one more question. This one is from Brandon. Brandon says, I live in South Africa. I listened to your podcast just now. It's given me so much perspective, and especially coming from a man. I grew up without a dad and just always longed for something which was superficially filled by my drug of choice. I'm sobbing at this moment since I'm going through addiction myself. I'm addicted to pot, YouTube, and porn. That sounds very weird. Doesn't sound weird to me, brother. I get you, man. But these things have literally ruined my previous relationship, and it's on the verge of destroying my current relationship, my work, and many other relationships. I'm going to look for help and to fix this, but I thank you for being a light to the world. Brandon, goodness, brother. Well, here's the thing. Pot, YouTube, and porn, bro, it gets way fucking worse than where you're at right now. So let me give you a little bit of hope in that, dude, you're going to be all right. You're going to get through this one, brother. You're not shooting dope yet. Oh my God. Life gets so much harder than where you're at, brother. And I understand that a lot of those struggles are quite relative to you. That, right now I would imagine it feels like you got the weight of the world on your shoulders. And don't get me wrong, you got some shit to work on. That's okay. Nothing wrong with that. It would be even weirder if you had nothing to work on. That sounds pretty boring, man. So you have some things to work on. Let's talk about those individually just for a moment. Pot. Well, the good news is pot is not physically addicting in a way that many other drugs are physically addicting. I do understand that you can have withdrawal symptoms. Sleeping can be very difficult. Some people do experience headaches and irritability, but for the most part, those are sort of on par with like being hungry. Like it's like a hunger pang. Yeah, it sucks, but you're gonna be fine. It's really not devastating. The withdrawals from pot are relatively minimal compared to most other drugs in the world. So when you're ready to stop, I'm gonna give you that 6-week challenge. I'm not here to tell you to never smoke pot again. I don't think you have to do that. I'm a believer that you probably could find some stability. I don't know that about you personally. Maybe that's not true, but I think more than likely it is possible that you can find a way to restructure your relationship with pot that makes it healthy. But what you need now, you need a break, dude. You need a good, solid break. So I'm going to give you that 6-week challenge. No pot whatsoever. None. And I want you to think about sobriety in a way that you may have never thought about it before. Sobriety is a fucking weapon. It is a weapon. It is your tool to combat all of the other things that you have going on. It's how you will arm yourself to stay off of YouTube. It's how you'll arm yourself to look at less porn. When you alter your state of mind, you can't have this expectation that you're going to have this high level of self-control when it comes to not looking at porn or to kill an hour on your phone watching bullshit on YouTube, right? So that would be my first challenge, man. Stop smoking pot and see if that alleviates the burden of these other things that you're trying to deal with at the same time. Because I know when I smoke, dude, It's really easy to like kill a bunch of fucking time on your phone doing absolutely nothing. But something about sobriety, being completely sober, not high at all, it does seem to make it a lot more boring, right? It's a lot less entertaining to go through Instagram. I don't even have Instagram on my phone anymore, but it's a lot less like fulfilling to do that. You're not as happy to sit around and do nothing. So I think one of the key, like the centers of solving this problem for you, man, is just going to be to find some comfort in sobriety. And I think you might need to redefine what sobriety is. Because if sobriety to you right now is boring and uninteresting and stupid, and if, you know, that's not what sobriety is, man. Sobriety is a fucking weapon. It's a really powerful one, and it gives you control over parts of your life that you might not feel very in control of, but if you're sober, you would be, at least to a degree that you're not used to experiencing. So that's a huge one. You know, another thing with YouTube, listen, man, YouTube is a source of media and data, of information. You know, I don't think it makes any sense to say, like, don't use YouTube necessarily. There's a lot of amazing stuff on YouTube. This is on YouTube, right? It might be where you're fucking watching it. So, you know, I'm not here to tell you that you need to eliminate YouTube from your life altogether. I wouldn't say that. But set some restrictions, set some boundaries on something like that. So for me, that would maybe be like something realistic, an hour a day or an hour and a half a day, and maybe also set those restrictions on the type of content that you're consuming. Because if you were watching 2 hours of TV a day, I don't think we can just say that that's bad for you until we define what the content is. Are you watching 2 hours of The Bachelor? Okay, we'll talk about a supreme waste of your fucking time. But are you watching philosophy, self-improvement videos? Are you learning a craft or studying a new skill set? Totally different way to spend your 2 hours. So maybe that's one way you could sort of amend your behavior when it comes to YouTube itself. Consume something different from that platform because it's not all bad. Certainly not all bad. And you know, with porn is a tricky one, man. It's tricky because it's a lot like alcohol in that some people don't have a problem with this at all. And other people have really big problems with it. So dude, it's going to come down to you. It's that internal truth, that internal honesty. You know, how do you define your relationship to porn? Sounds like you define it pretty negatively. And, you know, it is very difficult to admit that what you struggle with is a you problem. Doesn't mean that porn is bad for everyone across the board in every scenario whatsoever. Doesn't necessarily mean that, but could mean that you just can't watch it. This is the battle that I had with alcohol for a long time. Nothing wrong with alcohol. The drug didn't do anything. Plenty of people can drink. Most people can drink without a problem, but not me. I'm excluded from that category because of my brain chemistry, because of my physiology, because of shit that I don't seem to be able to control very well. So you got to make peace with that. And that might be something that eventually you have to make peace with, is just that this thing, it doesn't have a place in your life. And that's your fucking reality. You know, part of it could be that as well. I don't know. That's a harder one for me to speak to because it's not a particular problem that I've struggled with, or at least not an addictive context in any way. So I think the key here is going to be to do 6 weeks without any pot, man. I think when you completely remove pot from your life for just a period of time, you'll find that sobriety offers you a greater level of self-control, and that's going to make everything else subsequently much, much easier. And then also just closing thought, you know, incremental improvement, man. It doesn't have to be so black and white. It doesn't sound like you're at the bottom of a pit of addiction. It gets so much fucking worse than where you're at, dude. You know, I get that you're struggling with stuff. I believe you, man. I believe it's hard. And I hear some concern in your email. You're concerned for yourself, your relationship, for your job, you know. And maybe it's time that you should be concerned. But you don't have to do this dramatic 180 from the position you're in necessarily, but I do think you need to start taking some personal responsibility, setting rules and restrictions for yourself in the context of porn, in the context of YouTube. Shit, dude, do the 1 day at a time thing. You don't have to just say, I'm never looking at porn again. That's probably too tall of an order. Can you go an hour? Can you go 1 hour? Cool. 1 hour from now, you're not going to have looked at porn. That's it. And after that, how about you tack on another hour? Maybe at some point we can say it's the whole day. Maybe at some point it'll be this week I'm not doing that, right? And then eventually you can look out in the future and go, you know what? 2022, that's a zero porn year for me, right? Maybe that could be the case. So thank you for your question, man. I really appreciate your vulnerability. And yeah, brother, keep me posted. Our final question is from Nikki Zhang. He says, Dear Mr. Tumanero, I am Nikki Zhang. This is my second email to you. He did write another one. It was a little bit too deep of a question, genuinely, for me to get into in here. It's a great question. But anyway, he said, I want to thank you for starting the podcast. It has truly been an inspiration for me. I was wondering if you would be willing to cover what you see as your place in the world, or if you find that question inapplicable to you. Another subject that I'm curious about is if you ever feel that time will never be enough for you to do what you enjoy, that there will never be enough time for me to do what I like. Or if you felt the opposite, that there's plenty of time as our average lifespan grows longer. So let me answer your first part here. My place in the world. My place in the world is really rooted in contribution. As I kind of mentioned earlier in this podcast, I think I went into that a little bit more earlier, but contribution, leaving something here, not for my own personal legacy necessarily, though I think everybody should be interested in that to some degree, but more so, making sure that I spent my time appropriately, investing in things that made the world a better place for me, for my family, most importantly, for those that are very close to me, but also for the world as a whole. If I'm just lessening suffering or making people's experience on this planet a little bit better, that's my place in the world. It's why I'm an educator. It's why I wanted to do this podcast, because even as much as I have contributed in the context of the drum industry, that wasn't enough. I feel like I beat the game in that I contributed more than most people have. I contributed enough for a lifetime. If somebody really wanted to come to the drum industry and say, how can I learn all of this stuff? Okay, I already solved that problem. I created enough stuff there. I want to keep contributing. And at a certain point, I have to step outside of that music industry, the drum industry, to contribute even more. So an educator is sort of at the crux of this whole thing, but really my place in the world is just to be a contributor, right? To be a helper in some way. And that could be on a personal level, helping an individual. But for the most part, it's just contributing something, leaving something behind, making this place better than when I found it. If I'm not doing that, I don't know what business I have being here at all. And the second part of your question was related to time. Is there enough time to do all the things I want to do, or do I feel the opposite? Man, this is like to me, this is one of the epitomes of suffering in the world, is that you're going to die long before you're able to do everything you want to do. And for me, I want to do a lot of shit. A lot of shit. There are entire other career paths that I know if I had spent my 20s doing that instead of doing drums, I could have done it. I totally could have done it. I've wanted to start a firearms YouTube channel for a while. That was really interesting. When the vape world, I quit smoking cigarettes and sometimes I have this little vape, when that world first exploded on YouTube, when vapes and Juuls and all that shit became really popular a few years ago, I saw that industry in its infancy and knew that if I did that, I know enough about how these are built, I know enough about what's in them, that I could start one of those channels, and that would have been a whole career in itself. It could have been. It absolutely could have been. I want to make a documentary. I absolutely do. Jiu-jitsu has been something that I've been watching since I was a child. I understand a lot about it. I could call a jiu-jitsu match, no problem. I know all of the positions. But I've never done it because I picked a career path, a drummer, where injuring myself, my joints and my fingers or elbows or knees or hips or back, injuries prevent me from working. So it's always been a risk I've been unwilling to take, There's a whole lot of things that I want to do that I know I will not be able to do. And to me, I define that as suffering. That fucking sucks. I hate that there's a timer counting on my life and I'm going to run out of time. I fucking hate that. It drives me crazy. It's also deeply motivating because however many days you got left, the clock is running. Father Time is undefeated. He is going to come and he is going to fuck your shit up. You're going to get old. Your body will fail. You will die. You'll be buried in the ground where your corpse will rot into nothing. That's what's going to happen. There's no way around that. So every day is just so vital. It's so incredibly vital that you push forward towards the things that you might be able to accomplish, right? There's not even a guarantee that you're going to have the rest of this day. And time, truly, is the only thing of real value that you have. You may say, well, some of my things have value. Well, that's true, but time will take them eventually. If it doesn't take the things, it'll certainly take you off of this planet, so you don't get to enjoy the things. You might say, my relationships have value. Well, they do, but as long as you have time to enjoy them, right? Because eventually one of you is going to die, and then time's up. Now you have no relationship left to enjoy, right? Father time comes for everybody. It's getting everything. And, I would love to live 800 years. Imagine how fucking smart you'd be. Imagine the stuff that you could learn, the skills that you could acquire, the goals that you could accomplish. Imagine having that amount of time. God, that would be so fucking cool. So, earlier in this podcast, I mentioned that I think about death a lot, and I think about it in this context, Nikki. I think about it in that, death is coming. It's coming. I'm hurtling towards it at all times, at full speed, it feels like. And to me, it's incredibly motivating. It's one of the reasons that I am perpetually productive. I don't have off days. Those don't exist for me. That might be to my detriment at times, but that's where I am in at least my philosophical journey. There is no such thing as an off day. That doesn't exist. I'm just working on something else is what I'm doing. So no, there is not enough time. There's not enough time. And that's sad. And I think we're going to go out on that one. I don't know what else to say about that, brother. But I think being bothered by the lack of time that you may have is simply a sign that you like living, right? If you're unbothered by this concept that you are hurtling towards death, that might mean that you're not enjoying your life that much, So in some ways, I think because I like living, I love the life experience. That's why I'm sad that I don't get to be here for as long as I want to be here. That's why that's sad. It's sad because life is sick. I hope you feel that way too. Everybody might not feel that way, but that's where I am, and that feels good. So, somewhat of a silver lining, I suppose. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of All In with Adam, or listening to this episode. We are on Apple and Spotify now, so watch or listen, consume wherever you want to do that. Remember, you can call the hotline. I'll put the number on the screen once again. You can also email me any questions that you have at allinwithadam@gmail.com. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode. I really appreciate it. I will catch you all next week. I think we're going to have Kelly on the next episode if we can line our schedules up out here. So if you got any relationship questions or even questions for her, feel free to shoot those over. You got the hotline, the email address, or you can message me on Instagram. All In With Adam is the Instagram handle. All in the description. Check it out. Love you guys. Thank you for spending some time with me today, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye.